In our series, A String of Pearls, DutchBuzz contributors speak to people who have made an exceptional contribution to our local community. People whose passion for what they do have had an added value for the city of The Hague.
The ICC, the world's first permanent international criminal court based here in The Hague, has a new prosecutor. We spoke with Thomas Verfuss, the president of the Association of Journalists at the International Criminal Court, training editor at Journalists for Justice, and DutchBuzz contributor for the last 10 years. We started this interview by discussing the latest news of the International Criminal Court.
The third ICC prosecutor won in, Karim Khan QC, a British lawyer of Pakistani origin and lots of experience. He has been sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom, namely as lead defense counsel for Vice President Ruto of Kenya.
It seems that him taking this position was well received.
Yes, I mean, with all candidates, there are certain doubts. In his case, there is the problem that he has been lead defense counsel in a case which has not formally ended, the Ruto case. If new evidence becomes available for the office of the prosecutor, the case can go on. But on the other hand, he has a very high reputation for his professional and personal integrity. He has also been the president of the ICC Bar Association, and he co-authored a very important book about the ICC. So I do think he is a good choice of the states parties.
What is Bensouda's legacy?
Bensouda was, or still is, the first African chief prosecutor of the ICC, the first woman chief prosecutor of the ICC. What was good was the fact that she is African could help overcome that cliche that the ICC is a court in Europe that goes only after African leaders and African warlords. And she is a woman, and she has had lots of attention for sexual and gender-based crimes. She made it one of the priorities of her prosecutorial policy.
What is your motivation for your work at Journalists for Justice?
One of our main motivations was that it is important that the journalists of the country concerned should understand the ICC so that they can report correctly and passionately about the ICC proceedings, about their own country. So we first trained Kenyan journalists to write about the Kenya cases. You may know the president and the vice president of Kenya ended up being charged before the ICC, among a few others. We trained Ugandan journalists because one of the leaders of the Lord Resistance Army that waged a terrible kind of war against its own population in northern Uganda, with up to 100,000 victims, dead people, but also mutilated people, children kidnapped and turned into child soldiers. So when the first LRA leader, Dominic Ongman, had to stand trial in The Hague, we trained Ugandan journalists. And then you had former President Laurent Gbagbo of Ivory Coast, who was charged, arrested, brought to The Hague. So we trained Ivorian journalists. In Mali, terrible crimes were committed during the Islamist fundamentalist reign of terror in Timbuktu. So we trained Malian journalists. And the Central African Republic, one of the poorest countries in the world, also suffered from years of war, and when the first Central African suspects arrived in The Hague, we trained journalists from the Central African Republic.
What was included in their training?
We trained them, of course, on the Rome Statute, on the procedures of the court, on the special working methods you need to learn if you cover an international court, as opposed to the work you do, which some of those people have done at home, when you cover domestic courts. We also use the extensive contacts I have in The Hague to make sure that the journalists who are our guests here as trainees meet all the relevant actors in the judicial process, like the judges, the prosecution, the defense, the legal representatives of the victims, special organs that you will have at the ICC and that people are not used to from their domestic systems, like the Office of Public Counsel for Defense or the Office of Public Counsel for Victims. We can have them meet representatives of the ICC Bar Association, of NGOs that follow the work of the ICC, and there are many, about 2,000. We let them meet diplomats of the countries concerned. And of course, here in The Hague, there are lots of academic institutes like the Asser Institute and the Hague section of Leiden University, where the work of the ICC is very closely monitored, followed, and analyzed. So there are lots of interesting people to meet, and the visiting African journalists can interview them. And of course, they can also carry in their notebooks back home lists of email addresses and phone numbers that will be useful for their work later.
What are the main challenges of this mission, training journalists from situation countries?
So unfortunately, the lucky ones that can come here, it's small numbers only. Luckily, we have some donors we have been working with, like the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Civic Education in Germany, or Free Press Unlimited, or the Dutch Foreign Ministry, or the Municipality of The Hague. Give us money directly or indirectly, but it is not enough. Oftentimes, if you take, for example, the Central African Republic, we could take 2 journalists here. And for Ivory Coast, 2 journalists. And for Mali, we had a group of 4 or 5. It may sound like much, but you must see that those countries are often divided. So if you invite Ivorian journalists to the Gbagbo trial, you must make sure that you invite the pro-Gbagbo and the anti-Gbagbo journalists, because otherwise the group would not be balanced. Then in many African countries, there are the state media, whom you must also take into account. They have limited press freedom, but they may be the biggest source, most important source of information for large parts of the population. So if you want to reach the population, TV and radio is important, especially for rural areas, and many crimes the ICC deals with were committed in rural areas. So if you want to reach that population, you must be able to reach radio, and that will often be state radio, but luckily in many African countries there are also independent free radio stations that provide coverage and that are quite developed.
Well, the training of the journalists is an important work, but it's not the only obstacle in the high-quality reporting. What your role as the president of the Association of Journalists at the ICC has taught you?
Yes, I'm also the president of the Association of Journalists at the ICC. That was founded very soon after the entry into force of the Rome Statute in 2002. And it was founded, in fact, in the press briefing room of the ICTY by journalists who followed the work of the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And there we had lots of problems, first and foremost practical problems. And we, of course, also had, especially in mind, the journalists from what they call situation countries at the ICC, which is the countries that the cases and trials are about. Countries tend to get poorer because of the war. So it was difficult for Yugoslav journalists to come to The Hague, to live here, to cover the trials, except if you were a government propagandist. So the likes of Milosevic, Tudjman and Izetbegovic would send their propagandists to The Hague, which would then be reporting rather selectively. If the ICTY was misunderstood in the countries concerned because of biased reporting, it wouldn't be able to fulfill its mission.
That is a rational argument. I fail to see how there was not consensus there.
I remember when Sens had found the necessary money to have a permanent correspondent in The Hague, that former HINA correspondent, a Croatian lady, went to the aliens police, as it was called at the time, for her residence permit, and she told about her case. She was a journalist from Croatia, and she wanted to come to the ICTY and report about the trials concerning Croatia and Croatians. And the police told her, oh, well, your case is not foreseen in the system. They thought about judges who could come here from all over the world. Suspects were brought here against their will even. You could have defense lawyers and prosecutors from America, Japan, wherever. But if journalists from the countries themselves, countries concerned, wanted to come here, it was not foreseen in the system.
Have things changed since then?
So now the visas are not so much the problem. I mean, short-term visas are mostly delivered without too many problems. There is only one situation country journalist who lives here permanently, and that is because the others don't have money. So the visa and residence permit problem has been resolved, but not many journalists can make use of that possibility because they have no money to come here. But at the ICC now, thanks to our pressure from the association, there is a gigantic press center. It would be big to even accommodate all the journalists who would come for George Bush's initial appearance if it takes place one day. But on a normal day, the press center is almost entirely empty because the ongoing trials are about Africa, and those journalists, except for maybe for the Kenyans, but the Kenya trial is over, and Ivory Coast journalists also from time to time could come by their own means, but for the rest, it's unaffordable. So now we have a gigantic press center, but there are no journalists.
Well, the challenges are still huge, but you strike me as the type who will not give up fighting the good fight. Hence, we're interested in learning more about Thomas Verfuss, the person. Tell me, what is the one item that is always on your desk?
The Rome Statute.
And why?
The Rome Statute was the result of all that negotiating process, and people also talked to me about what I had been observing at the ICTY, so maybe for just quite a little I also had some input in the Rome Statute. In the 1990s, the geopolitical diplomatic situation was such as to be able to give birth to something like the Rome Statute, whereas many people say, when looking at the current mentality in international affairs, and international criminal justice is not as generally supported as it was in the 1990s.
The timing was ideal, and of course you were there to witness it firsthand. I can imagine why this feels so special. My last question for you. I asked you to bring one photo with a special meaning. I see there's a photo of you in front of the Peace Palace with one of your colleagues, one of your trainees from a situation country. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, I mean, for many journalists, it is a big experience to come to The Hague, to not only see the ICC with their own eyes, but all the rest which is around. Once an Ivorian journalist told me, in my country, many people think that La Haye, which is French for The Hague, is the name of the prison. Because they always hear on radio and television that Gbagbo, their former president, was in La Haye. So they think it's the name of the prison. And that made me think that it's a good step forward if the journalists have seen the ICC with their own eyes and met the main protagonists in person. But it is also good that the ICC just did not drop from the sky. Coincidentally, in The Hague, there is a whole history behind that, because the ICC is here because the ICTY was already here. And there is lots of expertise in The Hague about international criminal justice. And the ICTY was here because the International Court of Justice was here and the Peace Palace was here. Peace Palace has one of the best libraries on international law. There was even thought about the ICTY moving into the Peace Palace with the ICJ, but the building is not big enough. So then they went to that former insurance building in Stadtkwartier, not so far from the Peace Palace. And the International Court of Justice is here in the Peace Palace. The United Nations put the ICJ here as its only principal organ which is not based in New York, because the League of Nations had its permanent Court of International Justice here in The Hague, in the Peace Palace. And the PCIJ was put here by the League of Nations, not into the Palais des Nations in Geneva, where the League of Nations had its seat, but here in The Hague, in the Peace Palace, because the Peace Palace was already here, because it had been built for the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So there is a whole story to tell as to why the ICC is in The Hague, a whole story to tell that in The Hague there is not only the ICC, which tries individuals, but that there also is the International Court of Justice, which deals with conflicts between states, countries that have their cases at the ICC, they often also have cases at the ICJ, like Kenya has its maritime boundary dispute with Somalia. Uganda has its dispute with the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it is very interesting to take Ugandan African journalists not only to the ICC, but also to the Peace Palace.
Oh, now I want to ask you more about the Peace Palace.
I don't know if you've ever been inside the Peace Palace. The Great Hall of Justice is just impressive. I mean, the ICC is just a functional building. If there were no courtrooms, one would say it's an office building. But the International Court of Justice is in a palace, in the Peace Palace. It is a magnificent building to which all countries contributed something, or many countries, like Italy contributed marble, Germany contributed the gate, other countries contributed tapestry or vases or whatever. And the Great Hall of Justice it's an impressive room. I mean, all those impressive paintings with, of course, as theme justice, and the marvelous windows and the lamps. I mean, it's more than 100 years old and you can see it.
A palace as old and glorious as the values of peace and justice. Thomas Verfuss took us with him in the world of international criminal justice and the ideals of peace preservation by quality and fair reporting of the court's proceedings. A true pearl in The Hague, the city of peace and justice. This was Thomas Verfuss, the president of the Association of Journalists at the ICC. And I'm Elena Giola for DutchBuzz.
Meet the international community in The Hague.